please join me in welcoming our next keynote speakers, Dr. Angus Grant, Chief Business Executive of BeiGene, and Robert Mulrooney, General Manager of UK and Ireland. And they're going to be discussing fostering sustainable innovation in biotech. So without further ado.
Thank you very much. I'm Bobby Mulrooney. I'm the General Manager, as you've heard, for BeiGene in the UK and Ireland. This has been set up, as you can see, as a fireside chat. And I thought it was sort of slightly odd to be having a fireside chat at the tail end of the hottest summer we've ever had in Britain at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But anyway, here we are at the fireside. You have to imagine that the fire is blazing here behind us, and we've got logs burning away in a sustainable way, in a sort of a non-fossil fuel way. Yeah. I grew up in Ireland. I trained in medicine in Ireland, and I came to the UK as an economic migrant with a degree in medicine, some training in medicine, and I worked in the medical system here in the UK before moving into the pharmaceutical industry. I've worked in pharma in different areas, drug development, what we call medical affairs, and then more latterly in commercial roles at a local level, a regional level, Europe, and then everything ex-US, and finally at a global level. And I've been at BeiGene now for just a little over a year. And my colleague Angus and I are going to hopefully just give you a little bit of a feel of what it's like to have worked in this industry over time, why we see the industry changing, and where BeiGene is playing a part in disrupting and setting a new tone and a new pace for the pharma and biotech industry. And we're going to play this in the style of a sort of an interview. I'm going to ask Angus some questions. I might chip in occasionally, but he's going to do most of the talking. So, Angus, you are actually a man of the world. I mean, we're in a very global thing, but you're an unusual kind of person, and in the sense that you were born in England, yep. Scottish father, hence Angus.
Yep.
And you then have travelled extensively since then. You've lived in lots of different places since you were born in Royal London Hospital?
Yes.
Very good. Tell us a little bit about your life and career today.
And I have, at my house in Connecticut, I have a Starbucks mug collection where I have 140 Starbucks mugs from different cities and countries around the world.
Wow.
When I first started collecting them, my wife said they're not allowed in the kitchen, so they're in a barn. But a very nice barn. But no, it's been, I get the question a lot of times, how did you get to where you are? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background. So when we make representations about things, you know, Bobby's background and my background, and why we may draw some conclusions, and why we may have some open-ended questions, actually. So we're looking forward to the questions at the end as well. We learn something from you when you ask questions that help us identify where maybe our ability to explain what we're doing needs refinement. So we look forward to the questions. So after being born in London, actually spent 2 years in Singapore as a baby because back then my father had to do military service. We came back to the UK. That turned out to be a formative trip because in 1969, my father was asked to move to America to join a private practice. My mother was a nurse in the London hospital, so we moved to the States when I was 9. I grew up in Pennsylvania for the most part, went to school up and down the East Coast, eventually, as my parents would think, got my doctorate. So back in the mid-'80s, I started off in endocrinology research because my dad was an OB-GYN, thought reproductive medicine, but I discovered biotechnology and discovered the field of immunotherapy. Now back then, an old friend of the family, who's actually he's American, a physician, head of the Einstein Cancer Center. His wife was one of my mother's bridesmaids. So he was a mentor for me. And he was like, I don't know about this immuno stuff. It's like voodoo medicine. Because he was an old chemo guy. So back then, chemotherapy was like carpet bombing. You hoped to kill some cancer cells, and you probably killed a lot of other cells along the way. So the whole idea behind immunotherapy was, can we harness the power of the immune system to help fight cancer? We would see what's called spontaneous remission sometimes, when the immune system won the battle for some reason. Many years later, zoom forward, we find programmed cell death and PD-1 inhibitors to unlock or release the brakes on the immune system to fight cancer. But anyway, so I go to grad school, I meet Steve Rosenberg at the NIH, I change my career into immunotherapy. I go to the National Cancer Institute to work for a guy who discovered interleukin-2, which is sort of like Mother Nature. IL-2 is like, I think, the most important cytokine in your body, but it's just biased. And then I wanted to avoid writing grants, so I went to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the Center for Biologics, Division of Cell and Gene Therapies. Well, back in the mid-late 90s, cell and gene therapy was like all the rage. This was like the hot topic. So we were making stuff up, guidance for the FDA, with a group of us basically all under the age of 40, because no one had done this before. So it was fun days, heady days. And then I got asked to move to industry, and I got recruited by SmithKline Beecham. Well, my mother's father owned a chemist shop in Stoke Newington, anybody from the UK, and sold Beecham's powder. So I thought, well, I'll work for a British company. This will be fun. And it was vaccines, pediatric vaccines. Pediatric vaccines are boring, very, very useful. It's like take 5,000 children, take a blood, give them a jab, take a blood 42 days later and see what the immunity looks like. That's not quite the same as gene therapy. So then I got recruited to go to Rhône-Poulenc-Roy, a French company, to work in gene therapy again in the late 90s, before a guy, Jesse Gelsinger, died in a trial at UPenn. That totally changed the gene therapy field, set it back by a decade. There's an underlying story behind that I could get into, but I'll hold that for later. And then I got recruited, to go to New Jersey. My wife said, I don't want to go to New Jersey. So I found a job in North Carolina with Merck KGaA. Merck KGaA was German Merck, 360 years old. After World War I, Merck & Co. got spun off and Schering-Plough got spun off. Merck was coming back to the United States after 50 years. It was a little bit of a misadventure in North Carolina, and after a while I left there. But I'd been at the FDA, so I got pulled into regulatory. People were like, oh, you know the FDA, you must have like the secret decoder ring. You can tell us what they really meant when they write their little reviews. What did they really mean when they said, we strongly suggest, or we have an idea? You know, what does strongly suggest mean? Like, you'd be really dumb if you didn't listen to it. So I went into regulatory, but in regulatory, the FDA was really good at writing complete reviews of an application for a new drug application. So if you really wanted to know an independent arbiter's thoughts of a new drug application, and you're looking at a biotech to license it or buy it or partner it, the FDA record is fantastic. So I would get pulled into BD teams to review the regulatory record. I did that for a while, and then they said, hey, you seem to be good at this stuff. And then I met someone who became my mentor, George Golembeski. So I worked with him in North Carolina. He left, then I left. Went to work for him at Novartis. Then I left him, go to Celgene. Then he joined Celgene. I went to work for him again later. So I worked with him, for him, with him, for him, with him in 3 companies over 20 years.
Angus, can I just...
There's a story about networking there, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I was going to say exactly. I think there's, like, a lot of people here, are younger than us. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
Politely.
Pretty sure.
Pretty sure. But clearly in that, because in all of that, you've just talked about lots of different people who've touched on your career in different ways, or taking you somewhere, recruited you somewhere, giving you advice. Don't do endocrinology, or do immunology's voodoo. All of these different things, but in that, there's a lot about your network and the people around you, guiding you, steering you at that early part of your career. I mean,
yeah.
What's the sort of What's the trick? What's the secret sauce in managing your network and getting all that guidance, the mentors and everything else? How do you do that?
I think there's a big lesson in there for people going through their careers. With the one with George was, I was a friend with him. I went to work for him, but then I quit on him. And then he got recruited to the company I was in, and then they asked me to go work for him again. Luckily, I quit gracefully. And so in the field of oncology medical research, it's a relatively small field. We were just talking in the practice room, and we found out within 5 minutes that we have a common connection to a guy, Glenn Begley. I did my postdoc with him in the early 90s. He went to Amgen to work with some people. So if you're a good person and you work with lots of people and you think you're going to have a long career in this space, the intersections are unbelievable. And that's what makes it fun. You can change jobs, you can change careers. I've got 2 daughters. One's in university, one's about to go to university. I try to explain to them, networks are really powerful, not to get jobs, but to avoid making mistakes. I think when you can pick up the phone and call someone you trust and respect, and they trust and respect you, and say, that's a really bad idea. You can probably save yourself a lot of harm that way. But also, like if you've got a scientific question or a business question, you've got someone you can call up and talk to. I'm 62. I've worked for 6 biopharma companies, biotech company, 2 federal agencies, and I was CEO of a venture fund for 2 years, the Dementia Discovery Fund based in London. I also came back with Celgene for 3 years to be based in London when we bought a company and integrate a Swiss team with a British team. It's sort of the diversity of the experience. But one of the great things, I gather there are people here from 42 different places, countries, something. One of the great things about cancer research and drug development is you work with people from all over the world, all creeds, all races, all countries, all religions, because we have a common enemy. We're trying to fight cancer. Cancer doesn't discriminate. There's a little bit of genetic variation from here to there, but for the most part, cancer doesn't discriminate. It's an equal opportunity killer. And so I've felt incredibly privileged to work with bright, motivated people, all with a common goal. And many times I wish the world would do the same thing. I often joke we need an alien invasion to get us to unite to fight something that's not from this planet. But anyway, we should continue.
So clearly a very varied background, because not a lot of people worked at federal agencies and worked at the coalface, if you like, in the industry, and that sort of could be viewed as gamekeeper turned poacher a little bit to some extent. So that
the dark side.
Yeah, it's a bit like the dark side. And actually, when I moved from medicine, clinical medicine, hospital medicine, into the industry, people said, "Oh, you're moving to the dark side." The industry was viewed very differently. I think the pandemic and recent times have put the industry very much in the spotlight. I think people are much more aware of our industry. I think a lot more people have put their money into the stock of pharma companies and so on. People understand or question a lot more what our industry is doing. What would you say, now, today, are sort of the biggest sort of changes that you've seen, say, from when you started? And what do you think is the sort of future direction of travel? How do you see our industry evolving?
So a couple of the areas that I think are important to you in this audience are how is this industry evolving? And I mentioned sort of carpet bombing to guided missiles. Now we have very sort of focused and targeted therapies. So the idea is that we give patients therapies that don't cause side effects and collateral damage, that are just for the patient. The difficulty is that means you're going to be developing drugs in a very complicated system. The pharmaceutical business is probably the most regulated industry on the face of the earth. It's complicated. Why? Because we're trying to protect human health. We don't want to have bad things happen to patients. We want good things to happen for patients. Most patients in cancer trials where there's an active control and an experimental arm actually have, on average, a better survival outcome than the average patient who doesn't go into clinical trials. Why? Because you have 8 doctors caring for you. If you're running a cancer trial, you don't want your patient to die from a heart attack. You want to be able to study the cancer. So you make sure general medicine is taken care of. Right? So a lot of misunderstandings about our industry, about how complicated it is, how long it takes, why is it so expensive. It costs us on average $250,000 per patient in a clinical trial. Now, if you're going to do 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 patients, I'm not good with math, but it's a big number. Now you think about an investment over 10 years. Some of you may have an economics background or business background. You think about net present value. Well, if you discover something at the bench and you say, I think this is going to be a great treatment for cancer, you are 10 to 12 years away from any return on investment. You're going to go into this great sinkhole of spend over time. Manufacturing. To build an antibody manufacturing plant, anybody have an idea? Start with $400 million. Small molecule, less money. 5 years greenfield to build biologics manufacturing plants. You've got to have long-range vision, deep pockets, and those deep pockets have probably experienced failure. Bobby and I have probably experienced, I don't know how many drugs we've seen fail, but I've watched billions get flushed down the toilet in phase 2, phase 3, drug failed, no recovery, goodbye money, right? So the drug that gets to market has to make up for those losses. So what we've seen in our industry, though, is evolution in the regulatory landscape. We now work for a company that has a very large Chinese contingent. It's not a Chinese company, it's an international company, but there's a huge pool of patients out there in China. But what's really dramatic about China is they joined the International Conference on Harmonization, which US, Europe, and Japan joined many, many years ago and established standards for drug development. So now we have more and more countries that share the same common standards in drug development. We believe that's going to help us make drug development more efficient and quicker. And our business at BeiGene is to try to develop drugs quicker and cheaper using certain tools we have at our disposal. One is a large population of patients in China that have otherwise not been pulled into clinical trials. We can pull them into trials. There are other places around the world. We run clinical trials in, I think, 60 countries around the world now. So we pull patients from all over the world, but there's 1.4 billion people in China. The other thing is manufacturing. We spend a lot of time trying to drive down the cost of manufacturing. Yes, we build plants in countries outside of the United States and in the United States. The United States is more expensive to build and operate than, say, China. So we're trying to work on a global supply chain, but we're also trying to drive down the cost. We're using automation in manufacturing to try to drive down the costs. And why does that matter? Because once you've spent all these years getting a drug to market, you've got to make it, distribute it, warehouse it, sell it. So that costs money. So if you can drive down the cost of goods manufactured, the cost of goods in bringing it to market, now you've got a patent shelf life, you can make a return on investment more easily. So if the whole bar gets moved forward, if you can get to market quicker, if regulatory agencies become more consistent and easier to manage, you can save huge amounts of money on the front end, you don't need to charge as much on the back end, and everybody wins.
And I actually want to go back to something you were talking about, the cost of the whole development piece. And I want to do a little experiment in the room. If you imagine that I am, on one hand, I've got two personalities. On one hand, I'm a geologist with some sort of magic new technology, but I know of a secret lake of crude oil under the sea in the Gulf of Mexico. Absolutely, nobody else knows about it. It's untapped, guaranteed to give you oil for the next 10 years. And you can invest in that. Or on the other hand, I'm a biologist and I've just discovered the cure for cancer. Now, can you raise your hand if you would invest in the geology project first? Geologists, who's going to invest in geology and discovering oil? Hands up, please. Who's going to invest in the biology project, the cure for cancer?
Ooh, interesting.
Very good. Actually, Angus, prospects of success for my geology project and the prospects of success for my cure for cancer.
2%, both sides.
And the amount of money sunk and the amount of money returned for both sides?
2 billion, both sides.
Wow. So equivalent, but
10 years, both sides.
It's interesting.
You can visualize an oil rig. You can see a giant oil rig in the North Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, or anywhere else in the Mediterranean, wherever they put these oil rigs. You can visualize this giant oil rig with helicopter pads. It's hard to visualize how you spend $2 billion in 10 years developing a drug. But that's not every drug, but that is what various groups like the Tufts Institute comes up with. The numbers move around, give or take $1 billion. It's still a lot of money, and it's a lot of money put at risk for a long period of time. It takes an awful lot of people. Some people say it takes a village. It takes a lot of people to develop a drug to make sure it is proven to be appropriate. I'm not going to use the word safe because regulators don't like it. It's not safe. It does have side effects. Appropriate safety for the disease, appropriate efficacy for the landscape, that people would actually want to take it and pay for it. Our old CEO at Celgene, someone said, oh, this is really complicated stuff, all these health regulations and pricing bodies and stuff. He said, yeah, but if you develop medicines that make a difference to patients' lives, you'll probably do okay. If you keep that fundamental tenet in there, if you try to develop things that people will benefit from, you can probably figure out how to make it work.
I want to pick up on the idea of the village, because we've talked about network and everything else, but one of the things that I've experienced, at least, particularly in very large companies, and I worked at GSK for 11 years, and when I was at GSK, there were over 100,000 people worldwide. Angus and I work at a company that's about 8,500 people worldwide, and in fact, we've never properly met until May of this year, despite the fact that I've been at the company for over a year. So you can be in a very large company and not see people very often, and yet You have to work very closely with people. How do you bring the village together? How do you make people who may be very focused on my task is to do this and somebody else's task is over there? You know, any stories about collaboration, cross-functional working, interdisciplinary working? How does that,
well, I think,
why is it important?
Yeah, I think the pandemic has proven something to many of us. When I ran the Dementia Fund, I had an office in Boston and one in London, and we just had basically Zoom calls all day long. At BeiGene, because it had offices around the world, it was a Zoom culture before the pandemic. The pandemic, I think, reinforced to more people around the world that you can run companies and save a lot of people's time and effort commuting. It's great to go in. I think I heard something recently in the news, and I'm not going to say it's fact, but is that if you go into the office a couple days a week, you have a lot of joint creativity that comes out of that human interaction. So we still like and need that human interaction. We just don't need to do it religiously 5 days a week. So we can go into the office a couple days a week, and then the rest we can do by Zoom. Last year I hired 27 people, and I don't think I met any of them face to face. Now I've met them since then because things have lightened up in the US and over here. But I work with people in China that they report to me. I have never met them, and I don't know when I will. But I feel like a bond with them because we are fighting this common enemy called cancer. So again, I feel like we're in a privileged space because when you're fighting cancer, you're fighting something that's like everybody knows someone with cancer. I get calls all the time from friends of the family like, oh, so-and-so's got cancer, can you give me any advice? I'm a PhD, I'm not an MD. And I get like medical questions. Like, I have to qualify, I'm not a doctor, but I know a little bit about cancer. But I think that's a bonding thing. So I think if you find, you guys all know, you've heard it 1,000 times, you find things that turn you on and inspire you, you're probably going to be more successful. And we are fortunate, I think, because we work with, well, I was at the NIH and FDA. Bobby was in medical school. I didn't go to the FDA to be a regulator. We all came out of the NIH. We went there because it was just kind of a logical thing to do. It was like, sort of was there. We got to publish. We got to do research and help develop drugs. I go to industry because I didn't think I was the smartest scientist in the room. I didn't think I was going to come up with a Nobel laureate discovery, but I learned how to get people to work together. And there's a real power in that. If you can get people to work together, whether it's by Zoom or in person, you can solve problems. And if you share a belief in trying to solve a problem together, you can do great things. So when I left the NIH and FDA to go into industry, my whole mission was to try to be part of reducing that time from bench to bedside. I used to joke, a Nobel laureate discovery doesn't help anybody in Iowa. Many of you may not know about Iowa. It's in the middle of the country. I've been there. It's a lovely place. There's not a lot of science and innovation. I went to a bio meeting, and it was all about pigs and cattle. Like, what am I doing here? Anyway, so if you want to help people around the world, you've got to develop the drugs in a way that can be distributed for around the world. So at BeiGene, one of our objectives is to try to do a better job of developing drugs for more people around the world. It's our mission statement. It's our founders believed in trying to disrupt the way we did things. How? Trying to run trials for less money, trying to run trials faster, trying to manufacture drugs for less money, but also making cognitive decisions of what to invest in and what to not invest in. When I was in other companies, we didn't worry about cost of goods manufactured. I worked in autologous CAR T cells. Basically, for a round number, it's $1 million a patient between manufacturing, administration, and management of the patient. Well, that's not affordable in a lot of countries in the world. So that's not going to fly. At BeiGene, if I'm licensing something, I look at the cost of goods manufactured as one of the first questions, then intellectual property. Because if it's too expensive to make, it doesn't matter if it has no IP. We're not going to do it. So if we make things which are more affordable on a per patient per month basis, and then we can develop them for less, we can sell them in more countries around the world at a reasonable price. Affordability is a fuzzy question, but governments set standards of how much they're willing to pay and reimburse. China has very defined standards. We know how much we can get reimbursed in China, and if we can sell it in China, we know we can sell it in a lot of other countries around the world. And that price in China is a fraction of what the US pays and a fraction of what you pay in most countries in Europe. So we start from the very beginning in drug development to try not to fall into the trap of like, oh my God, It's going to treat a small number of patients. We spent $1 billion. We're going to charge each patient $10 million in order to make our money back. We won't go there. We won't make that. We will not make that decision to go into that drug. Now, that's a difficult ethical question. We got 2 minutes left for. Is that for questions or for?
No, we're good. We're good.
To go to Q&A.
No.
Total.
Total.
Okay, so I'll hurry up and finish this. So it's a difficult question then as a company. If you find an ultra-rare disease and you think you've got a cure for an ultra-rare disease, so in my mind, you almost need to have separate companies. A company that is focused on that ultra-rare disease, and people go, wait a minute, Pompei's disease was a classic one years ago. There's no way those kids will get a treatment unless someone spent a lot of money and has to charge a lot of money to get that treatment. But if you're running a big company, you can't do that. That really puts you in harm's way with regulators and payers. So you almost have to sort of separate the companies. Say one company's going to go for mass markets, one's going to go for niche. It's all like Volkswagen versus Tesla. Not quite, not even close.
I think
Anyway, questions?
I just want to pick up on one thing you said, though, about getting the cost of goods down. That's clear. Manufacturing, doing the clinical trials more cheaply. And I think when you say something like that, that's going to cause alarm bells ringing for people. We saw this with the pandemic. They developed the vaccines too quickly. They didn't do it correctly, and so on. But so how is BeiGene going to develop medicines more quickly, more cheaply, without compromising on quality? But in a way that then allows BeiGene to pass on that benefit, if you like, on cost to governments and patients.
So a lot of work. I think the vaccines are a great example. So the AstraZeneca adenovirus-based vaccine, I was working on advirus vectors in the late 90s for cystic fibrosis. That stuff's been around for a while, and everybody's seen an advirus. Most people have been exposed to it. The RNA vaccines, Moderna was focused on cancer for many years. Didn't work. Worked brilliantly for COVID. So a lot of the general public forget that the years and years of investments in the research labs in universities, in the biotech companies, in the pharma companies, sometimes pop out 10, 20 years later as, wow, this can work for this problem. We've had it on a shelf for a while. So the cumulative knowledge that is built up sometimes comes in really handy.
And I think that's also true for CAR Ts, which been the last 5-10 years, CAR Ts have really found their place in blood cancers particularly.
Yeah.
But the CAR T leader and idea came from virology. I mean, so this is an idea of where somebody who's completely a specialist in a different area just looks at a problem in another area through that filter and sees a completely different solution to that which everybody else has had. And it comes back to the point about the need to collaborate, to work with other disciplines and so on.
Back in 1985, I was making LAC cells, lymphocyte-activated killer cells for patients with glioma. All we were doing was taking the lymphocytes, stimulating them with IL-2 and putting them back in. That was pretty crude soup. Then we get to what Bobby just described, genetically engineered cells. And now we're going even deeper into RNA engineering, DNA engineering, and modification. So the technology, if you're a scientist, is really cool. Sorry. Yeah. Should we take questions if we're down on time?
Yeah, I mean, finish up.
It says 16.
It says 16
we've been baited
here,
by
so
16 minutes.
Yeah, and I think we were given another 15 for questions as well. So anyway, let's go to the floor, because actually you guys have got more interesting. Please start here. And where you're going is fine. Thank you. We'll try and do this in an orderly way.
Hi, Dr. Angus. I'm Juan, and I'm from Imperial College London. A very straightforward question. When will we cure cancer?
So that's a question I've been getting for 30 years. And cancer is hundreds of different types. And so we do actually have cures for some types of cancer. We also have treatments for some kinds of cancer that if you're diagnosed with it, like the field that I worked on at Celgene, the average age of diagnosis is 65. Well, we can treat those patients and manage those patients through a series of treatments for 20 years, where basically we can say to the patient, keep taking Lipitor for your cardiovascular disease, because we've got the cancer under control. Your cardiologist needs to take care of your heart too. So that's why we're seeing a prevalence now of dementia, because we're living longer from cancer, we're living longer from cardiovascular, we're living longer from infectious disease. And now the next organ system to start to fail is your brain. So we won't find a cure for all cancers, but we will start to chip away and find cures for one at a time.
I think the point you made earlier on, though, that we've moved away from the carpet bombing, and the approach to every single cancer now is a lot more targeted. And in fact, our lead treatment here in the UK for BeiGene is a treatment for a rare form of lymphoma, a blood cancer. And probably 5-10 years ago, nobody would have conceived of even testing a medicine in this area. But we've got a medicine that definitively works, and next week, NICE will publish its guidance on the benefit of this medicine in the treatment of something called Waldenstrom's macroglobulin anemia, which is easy for me to say, but there are other questions. Please put your hands back up again. I'm going to go to this young man here. Sorry. I should stop prefacing everybody with young. Because
I am a young man. Just a quick question to... my name is Marco, PhD student from Cambridge. Just a quick question about something that you said about China. I'm very interested because you said that you run clinical trials in China and you try to expedite drug development, which I find interesting. But the question is, if you're running clinical trials in China with the objective of then selling your drug to the rest of the world, clearly there is an incompatibility in terms of ethnicity, lifestyles, and other factors. So from a regulator's perspective, if you do develop your assets in China or if you in-license them from Chinese companies, how do you then sell them to the rest of the world?
So we run trials in China, but we run global clinical trials. So we don't just run them in China. If you just run a trial in China, you're probably not going to have much success with the EMA or the FDA. You need to have a more diverse population. The real key is your clinical trial has to have a patient pool that the regulators can say, this matches the people I'm going to license it for. I can write a prescription for people in France, for people in the US, and people in China at the same time. It's really hard to do. Sometimes it's almost better to run trials in different territories. Same drug, slightly different trials, geared towards the practice of medicine in that country. And you have to look, especially if you're doing follow-on treatment following a particular regimen, like post-chemo regimen, it's still around, unfortunately, is that it's the same chemo regimen in China, in the US, in Europe. So sometimes that varies. So it's complicated.
I think it's a really important question because actually, there are pharmacogenomic differences between different. So, if you take just a very crude example, but people of Chinese origin tend to be deficient in an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase, for example. They have other enzymatic differences to, say, European Caucasians. And those enzymatic differences have a bearing on how drugs are metabolized and handled by the body. So you need to be able to have that diversity that Angus described. And in statistical terms, it's called generalizability. You've got to be able to generalize from the trial to a population. I know you've got another question. So you do the trials. And so for example, at BeiGene, we have our clinical trials will either be a single trial done globally, or it might be a trial done for China, a trial done in Europe and the US, say, for example, in separate territories. So please, here in the middle, towards the back. I know there's some over here as well. Come there.
And one down here.
Hi, my name is Reza. I'm a med student and startup founder. I had a question about CAR T therapy, actually, because as you said, it's very expensive, but it's actually been one of the most promising forms of immunotherapy. And there's this theory that as technology improves, the cost of technology tends to go down. Do you think that would happen in the future with CAR T therapy, and that then it would be accessible to healthcare markets?
It is happening. So at Celgene, we did a deal with Juno, and then actually the last deal I bought was BeiGene for $9 billion. And we had a partnership with Bluebird for their CAR T therapy. So a lot of the effort is to drive down costs. One of the problems with CAR T therapies, you have to build a factory where you take each patient's material and put it into a dedicated clean suite. So there's no mass production. That's expensive. And part of the cost of developing drugs is all the regulations around manufacturing. So you have what's called a batch record on a single patient basis instead of one batch record for 1 million vials. Imagine, that gets expensive. It's hundreds of thousands of pages of documentation on a per patient thing, right? So that's part of the problem. The other problem is with CAR Ts, unfortunately for the patient, you may donate your cells, and if they get infected, you don't get a treatment. So there's treatment, there's production failure as well. But what CAR T has done for us is say, hey, we can actually go for curative intent with these suckers. So that's why we're moving to iPSC CAR NKs, iPSC CAR T cells, even iPSC macrophages, stem cell derived allogeneic cells. So the next wave is going to be what people call off the shelf. There's a limitation there that even a batch of those may only treat 10,000 patients at the most. So it's still not going to 1 million patients worth of treatment. But through one, we learn how to do the next, we learn how to do the next. And that's the construction of knowledge that helps us, like the mRNA vaccines, failed in cancer, brilliant for COVID.
It's sort of Moore's law, isn't there? It does. There's a question over here. Yes, please. It's just sort of 3 rows from the back with white shirt and glasses.
Hi, my name's Ryan, and I just finished my Bioscience Enterprise degree at the University of Auckland. And I was wondering, you talked earlier about, IO becoming like sort of a replacement or as a better option than chemotherapy. What do you think, because we're increasingly seeing, IOs targeting, increasingly specific biomarkers in certain populations, like, oh, this IO will target 1% of this type of cancer. Is their development coming at the expense of broad-based therapy? So,
no, because if you can develop a drug for all of lung cancer,
yeah,
you're going to make a lot of money. So people are constantly going to look for a drug for all of lung cancer. But in some countries, like the US, every lung cancer patient in a major center is fully sequenced. So we now have drugs for very specific segments of lung cancer, which 20 years ago we didn't have. It was more carpet bombing, a lot of chemotherapy. So a bit of both, like checkpoint, PD-1s, PD-L1s are used in multiple cancers. This is a really rare event to have a drug that can be used in multiple cancers as a backbone therapy. And now we can build on it. And we're doing that at BeiGene. We have multiple IO combos. But the other thing is chemos. Now we're antibody drug conjugates. So now use the targeting capability of the antibody that carries the toxin on it, so you don't have off-target toxicity, so long as it stays together before it gets to the target cell. So that's another piece of engineering, is to keep the two together. Then once they get internalized in the cancer cell, the toxin gets liberated and kills the cancer cell. So we look at all of them. We look at drugs that will work in a single type of cancer, across cancers, or in a highly genetically defined subset of cancer patients.
Brilliant. Yes, please, here in the center, just the front.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm a PhD student in neuroscience at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And the question I had...
Close to the NIH.
Very close. So the question I had, obviously regulatory concerns are one of the first things industry worries about. But for those of us working in academia on basic mechanisms of disease, we maybe ask what our sample population looks like and if a drug can cross the blood-brain barrier. Do you think it would be productive for academic basic scientists to consider regulatory affairs in perhaps the targets they try, or is that really just worrying about a problem outside the scope of our work?
I don't think you have to worry about the regulatory stuff that much in the beginning. When you're in the labs and you're trying to sort of develop something for a neurological disorder, you do want to think about safety. If all the mice die, that's not a good outcome. But I don't think you have to worry about the FDA sort of IND provisions quite yet, unless you're in an academic lab that does want to make a clinical batch and go into a phase 1 clinical trial. Then it's probably worth calling a few experts. But in the Beltway area, there's a couple of good regulatory experts, ex-FDAs, that could give you guidance.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that in a different way, and it's not the question you asked, I know, Ryan, but I also think it's very important that commercial concerns don't constrain scientific thinking. Because I think sometimes if you're too focused on, well, where is this going to work, you'll miss the pluripotentiality of things. And, Angus has mentioned a couple of times now, serendipitous findings in another place actually, can be the thing that ultimately leads to commercial success. It's much better that scientists do the things that, sort of sow many seeds and see what blossoms, basically. Just at the very back here at the end of the aisle, and then we'll go to the side over here at the very back as well.
Hi, Pavel, PhD student studying cancer drug resistance in London Institute of Medical Science. Despite being a cancer researcher like yourself, I'm actually more interested to find out, given your decades of experience studying and developing therapies for cancer, what things you learned there worked and didn't work for when you tried to develop medicines for dementia.
How long have we got?
So my father had Parkinson's and Parkinsonian dementia, and I was actually in London doing a deal between Celgene and Evotech when I got asked to do this job. And I thought, for my dad's sake, I would do this. I was a bit of a fish out of water. But the thing that struck me, and I went back to cancer because that was more familiar. I just had dinner with some of the guys from the DDF last night. The thing that struck me was our understanding of cytokine biology, how it has moved into things like psoriatic arthritis, is going to go into neuroinflammation. When we understand how to dampen the inflammation in the diseased brain, I truly believe we will extend life, we will extend quality of life. And you think about, I'm 62, you're all younger. At the age of 50, sorry to break it to you, your neurons start to die. So it's a matter of like if you're on a ski slope. You're going to take the blue run, the green run, the black run, the double diamond run. You're going to go to the clubhouse at the bottom. But it's how quickly do you get there? Do you become demented at 105? That's a good life. Do you get demented at 55? That kind of sucks. So I do believe we are going to find medicines people can take over long periods of time which will dampen and slow down neurological death and dementia. That's my belief system. Because I need it. I'm getting old.
Yeah. It's as much a hope as it is a belief, right?
Yeah.
Just in the back row here as well.
Self-centered.
Yeah. Enlightened self-interest.
Hi, I'm a PhD student here at Cambridge studying cancer biology. So kind of two parts to my question. The first one is, so a lot of people are now trying to do cell and gene therapies in like solid tumors and stuff. I was first wondering whether you think how the landscape will change for that over the next years in terms of the balance between those types of therapies and just standard small molecule drugs. And the second part is then how you think that will affect the reimbursement strategies and how we actually assess the value of medicines in terms of like these one-time therapies versus like a continuous drug.
Well, I worked on a gene therapy project in 1999 doing adenovirus P53 gene therapy for head and neck cancer and lung cancer, and it didn't work. We've made a lot of progress in understanding how to better transfect cells and how to better get them there. Solid tumors are tough because it's a very tight tissue matrix. We've got the same problem with cellular therapies. They haven't generally done a good job of penetrating, but I can tell you that is sort of the holy grail for the cell therapy companies and gene therapy companies, is to get to solid tumors. From a market perspective, solid tumors are about 80% of the value proposition. Hematology is about 20%. So a lot of people would love to crack that code. So I'm optimistic and hopeful we will.
Maybe I can pick up on the point about value and how you assess the value of small molecules. I mean, different markets, if we call them markets, but different countries have different ways of looking at them. And by and large, certainly ex-US, most countries in the world have some form of government payer system. And here in the UK, it's the NHS, and we have NICE here in the UK, who determine the value of a medicine, determine whether a medicine is cost effective, whether it's a gene therapy or a small molecule or anything else, and devices as well, by the way. And so different countries approach it differently. Some look at it in terms of a very economic cost effectiveness model or a utility model. In other countries, they're just looking at it from a purely budget impact perspective. So you might say, well, in this country, we've got 10 children per annum who have some monogenic disorder which could benefit. But actually, if we're going to treat all of them, that's going to cost the country 20 million. And a small country might say, we don't have that kind of money. And then on a larger country might say, well, actually, if we cure, or at least functionally cure all those children, they all go on to lead productive lives and they all live to 80. The economics of it are worthwhile. So a cost-benefit model actually favors that. So the assessment of medicine's value is very different on a country-by-country basis.
Another quickie on gene therapy. Some gene therapies, like adenovirus gene therapies, are not that expensive to manufacture. You can produce ad vectors in a small reactor. Cell therapy is a different issue.
Yeah. Just here?
We have one over there. Lady back there.
You're going to cut us off?
Yeah,
Okay,
unfortunately.
very good.
Oh, we're going to get cut off?
Very good.
She's been waiting for a long time, though.
Sorry.
Okay, so we...
Just
one
more.
last question.
We're okay for time if you guys, unless you have a party to go to.
Thank you very much. My name is Blessing. Okay, from Nigeria. I think I have listened so much to what many speakers have been talking about, and it looks as if, like she said, those of us coming from developing countries are kind of being cut off. So I just want to ask you, about your company, what do you have for those in developing countries? The trials you've been doing, have you done any ones there? Because another problem we face with cancer, it is not about the treatment, it is when we get to know we have cancer. So is there any hope for them? Is there anything you're looking at, I don't know, to save those from developing countries before it gets, to the stage where it cannot be handled anymore?
So we're looking to distribute our products in more countries than anybody in our stage would. BeiGene is not profitable yet. It is spending more money on R&D than it is making. And at some point, we have to cross those curves because the investors will get fed up with us. We're pushing into more countries at a faster rate than any company I know at this stage in its evolution. But you're right, for Nigeria, my brother lived in Kenya for 3 years. Modern medicines don't get there very quickly. So we've got to do a better job. There are countries around the world that are completely underserved. And one of the missions that was part of the foundation of BeiGene was that we would not be like traditional big pharma. There are a couple of big pharmas that they look at like 9 countries. They think their business model is fine with 9 countries out of the world. We're looking to try to break that paradigm. So wish us luck, and we'll try to come visit Nigeria.
I think you raise a very important point. I mean, because and Angus talked a lot about affordability and how we do things to re-engineer, manufacturing processes, clinical trial processes, and so on, to do those things more efficiently, cost-wise. But the second question, the question you raise, is about how do you then, if you have an affordable medicine, how do you make that accessible to somebody in a village in Nigeria, say? So, I think for us as a company, that would be about partnerships with either governmental organizations or non-governmental organizations to try and create the infrastructure, support and partner with the infrastructure to make sure that the medicine is delivered. It's A, affordable, and B, accessible to patients all the way through the system. But it's a big problem, as in, yeah, please wish us luck. I think that's exactly right. I think we are out of time. It's been a real pleasure, and the questions have been phenomenal. So thank you very much. Angus, thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.